GB News has always veered towards the wilder side of broadcast news, but the channel is now officially out of control. A key figure amid the chaos is the far-right host Mark Steyn. Steyn had been off air since mid-December when he had 2 heart attacks, but he's now publicly rejected his offer for a return. He filmed this angry address from his living room.
We're going to do a new edition of the Mark Steyn Show this week, assuming my occluded ventricles are up to it. But it won't be on GB News. The state of play between me and GB News is that they have sent me a contract. Don't worry, I'm not going to do that Stephen Crowder thing where you read out the terms of your contract, because I don't think that makes for great television. So I'm just going to skim a couple of clauses. These are the ones. People have noticed a change. Now, this came up. I was already set to return to GB News, and the habitual liar who runs the joint then decided that we needed a defibrillator in the studio for me to be able to go back. And then a lady who works on the show said, no problem, defibrillators are us, sending one round in 20 minutes. Then he decided something else. So the state of play at the moment is that he's sent me a contract. This is a guy called Angelos Frangopoulos, the CEO of GB News. And the contract's he's chosen to change the terms by which we do the show, which would be stressful, but I've had 2 heart attacks, so I laugh at stress. I scoff at stress. You don't stress me out. You may be a homicidal maniac intent to bringing on a 3rd fatal heart attack, but you'll have to do better than this. But I did think it was interesting in light of what's happened at GB News. There's this new clause, editorial responsibility. For the avoidance of doubt, as the Ofcom license holder, GB News has editorial responsibility for the Mark Steyn Show and all content produced for GB News by the presenter and the US producers. Therefore, the parties agree that GB News's editorial decisions shall prevail, which I wouldn't really mind. But I remember we had a little Ofcom back and forth about 10 minutes before I went on air a couple of months back. And my final words about the so-called compliance officer was that he was, quote, Ofcom's bitch. And at that point, I hung up. Well, Ofcom's bitch has managed to have his revenge now.
So the reason Ofcom regulations might be a point of dispute between Steyn and his former bosses is that last June he interviewed COVID conspiracy theorist Naomi Wolf. She made a number of false claims about the COVID vaccine, and viewers made 411 complaints to Ofcom, triggering an investigation. In the new contract that Steyn was offered, it said that if he goes against GB News' editorial standards, he'd be held liable for any Ofcom fine. So they clearly didn't want to be taking any of those risks anymore. Now, these guys they care about their profit margin, so it might be understandable that they would make that precaution, but it hasn't gone down well with GB News fans. Texas Lindsay, who has 71,000 Twitter followers, said this, or Texas Lindsay, sorry. Breaking. Legendary news anchor Mark Steyn quits GB News after they threatened to make him pay fines to the media regulators for casting doubt on safety of COVID-19 vaccines. Significant loss for GB News. Thank you for your bravery and integrity, Mark Steyn. Eva Vladingerbrock has over 300,000 Twitter followers and has appeared on GB News and Fox News multiple times. She also weighed in. The truth on why my friend Mark Steyn isn't back on GB News. After he suffered 2 heart attacks, they lied to him, used his medical condition against him, and tried to force him to comply with Ofcom's censorship rules, even holding him liable. How low can you go, Frangopoulos? That's the Twitter handle of the guy who manages GB News. Current host then went on Twitter to encourage their free speech loving audience to get on board with Ofcom. Actually, they're in favor of the regulators now. This is from presenter Bev Turner. It's worth remembering that YouTube is far worse at quickly removing content than Ofcom, who, believe it or not, have guidelines which are easy to navigate with very little effort. Sometimes it's just a sentence which provides balance. Do you really want a broadcast media which is completely unregulated? Pedophilia, religious or political extremists, any number of nutcases broadcasting into your front room. Imagine nutcases broadcasting into your front room. If you work at GB News, it must seem completely alien. Really? I've never been told what I can or can't say on GB News, but I'm not sufficiently selfish to mouth off and risk losing appeals to Ofcom, whatever. That was a GB News host warning how terrible it would be if nutcases were allowed on our TV to talk about extremist ideas. Speaking of nutcases espousing extremist ideas, Neil Oliver is a historian who peddles conspiracy theories on the channel. In a recent show, he said this.
Here in Britain, they like to tell us we have the mother of parliaments. It's hardly true, but it's a good line for the tourists. But if our parliament wins this war, it will have consequences for the whole of the West and the whole of the world. Those aware of the silent war know it's been going on for many years. Some learned souls will tell you it's been the stuff of decades, if not centuries, passed between generations of politicians and others. The strategic objective is total control of the people. This is being achieved not by bullets and bombs, but by stealth, sleight of hand, and the misuse of legislation. Those in pursuit of centralised power, of a one-world government, hate, and with every fibre of their being, sovereign nation-states. That said, they reserve a special loathing for national constitutions that define the rights of people in perpetuity. Total control of the sort the state has in mind requires the hoodwinking of the people into thinking Parliament is the highest power in the land, that they tell us what to do. It's interesting to note that hoodwinking is a term from the art of falconry, whereby a falcon with lethal talons, the swiftest attacking flight and the sharpest eyesight of all living creatures, is kept docile and under control simply by having a little hood placed over its head.
So I have to say, I enjoyed the details about falcons, but the rest of it was fairly concerning, I suppose. We have a silent war, a one-world government, and generations of politicians trying to take control of the people. Very rousing, very paranoid, you might think. GB News is now under fire for alleged anti-Semitism. Journalist Matthew Sweet tweeted this. Okay, this is serious. The Coast Guy, so that's Neil Oliver, would seem to be summarising the arguments of secret weapons for silent wars, a protocols of the Elders of Zion type hoax document that circulates as real in the maddest circles of conspiracy culture. Condemnation of GB News followed from the Board of Deputies and also from the all-party parliamentary group against anti-Semitism. Nicola Richards is their chair. She said, this media diversity is incredibly important, but not at the expense of professional standards. These developments should be of concern to GB News editors, owners, and producers, and I hope they will be carefully reviewing them. With any public platform, there is a responsibility not to open the door to conspiratorial anti-Semitism or other misinformation. No doubt Ofcom will be keeping a close eye on developments at GB News, but let's hope that the channel will get its house in order.
The thing with GB News is that GB News keeps running up against the same kind of internal contradiction, which is that, it's desperate to be taken seriously as a legitimate news source, and it really wants that validation. But also its raison d'etre is to be completely batshit. Like, it's founded on the paranoia and, in delusions of a very small number of very, very wealthy men who have far too much money and an imagined sense of persecution. People for whom the entire world is like designed for their comfort and ease, who now believe that they are being persecuted and are being cancelled constantly, just because groups of people that they're not used to having to listen to and now having like the tiniest little platform. And so when you have, an organization whose kind of foundation is based in that trying to drum up paranoia and, ultimately rooted in not in a rigorous analysis of the world, but in like delusional paranoia, it's going to give rise to this kind of stuff. It marketed itself from the very beginning as, the British version of Fox News, or it was kind of positioned in that way. And yet at the same time, it's trying to be, taken seriously. And, obviously Fox News, this is something that has developed over 20 years. It's been embedding itself in the news landscape of the US in a way that GB News hasn't yet had the chance to do here. And I do actually think that as sort of enjoyable as it is to watch GB News constantly tie itself in these knots and kind of run up against this contradiction, I don't necessarily think that it's impossible that a Fox News style broadcasting, company or whatever could become as powerful in the UK. I think that currently they're in a stage of experimentation where they're trying to figure out how this could work. You know, the context is kind of different here because we don't have, the US doesn't have like a Ofcom style regulator that really gets into this kind of nitty gritty, like fairness doctrine or like fact checking and things like this. So they don't come up against the same kind of institutional resistance. But I think that, you know, as ridiculous as it is now, and as failed an experiment as it is now, these are people with a lot of money who are willing to throw a lot of resources until it works. And so maybe one day they'll find a way to move through that contradiction. But yeah, it has a crisis of identity. It wants to be taken seriously, but the ideological foundations of it are delusional and batshit. So it's going to keep having this issue. For now, it's entertaining to watch. I just hope that they don't get any better at it.
Apparently, Ofcom are considering action against GB News over the content of that Neil Oliver clip we just showed you. But if the station does get shut down, now I think this is unlikely, you will still have another source of high quality right-wing news, because over on Talk TV, the Murdoch-owned right-wing platform, they're doing some pretty hard-hitting journalism, as you can see from this tweet from Piers Morgan. Update. In a global TV exclusive, the woman who took Prince Harry's virginity in a field behind a village pub gives me her truth after he invaded her privacy in a kiss and tell book. My interview with ex-royal groom Sasha Walpole airs on Piers Uncensored. Some hard-hitting journalism there.